Hi, this is Gary with MacMost.com. On this episode, let's talk about the best, the coolest, the weirdest vintage Mac designs, like this one. These videos are made possible by an incredible group of people that support MacMost over at Patreon. If you'd like to join us and get exclusive content, go to MacMost.com/Patreon. So when talking about vintage Macs and Mac design, you really have to start with the original, the Mac from 1984. This set the stage for the whole first generation of Macs. And it really was a very different design than computers of the time. The weirdest out of all of the first generation Macs definitely had to be this one. This looks like a Lisa, which was another computer developed by Apple at the same time that was a big failure. In fact, it was such a failure that Apple was left with a bunch of hardware and they converted them to Macs and created the Macintosh XL. It was actually a Lisa using software emulation to become a Mac. This thing sold for $4,000 in 1985. It wasn't a huge hit, but it allowed Apple to get rid of all this extra Lisa hardware. Now, out of all the first generation Macs, this one is my favorite, but probably because it was my first Mac. This was a Macintosh SE. It was 1987. It was $2,900, and the school I went to, Drexel University, actually required all students get one. This thing had 2 floppy drives, and what you would usually do is put the operating system and one app on one floppy and then your data on another. So you'd boot up from one floppy, have the app, say a word processor you were going to use, and then use that to edit files that were on the other floppy drive. Now, a lot of Apple's most interesting designs were also commercial failures. Take, for instance, the 1989 Macintosh Portable. This was pretty much a failure at a 16-pound portable computer that cost $7,000, $14,000 in today's money. But it did introduce features like an LCD screen, the idea of a portable computer running on a battery. Apple was pretty early to this game, and this was just the first in a long line of portable Macs, many of which would be very successful. The Mac Portable was soon followed by the PowerBook series. And my favorite out of all those was the PowerBook 160 because this was my second Mac. I bought it in 1992. It cost a little under $4,000. And it was interesting because it had a grayscale screen capable of 16 different shades of gray. You could hook up an external monitor to it. It was actually really portable. I used to bring it to the school library, and I remember being the first person there in the library to actually be working on a laptop computer. Apple got pretty boring with their design in the mid-90s. But then in 1997 they came out with one of the weirdest Macs ever. This is the 20th anniversary Mac. And it was an expensive machine, $7,500. But it got you this design unlike anything Apple produced before or since. It was actually a showcase to show what new technologies were coming up. So it had things like a color LCD screen, this built-in sound system. It had a built-in CD drive. You could even tune in TV stations and FM stations with it. And it also featured a trackpad as its main input device, not a mouse. It was only a year later in 1998 that we got the iMac. And the iMac was an extremely successful computer, bringing the Mac back into the mainstream. The price was pretty reasonable. It was only $1,300 for one of these. It was an all-in-one Mac just like the original. And it's kind of funny because it originally was a very weird looking computer, but it was so popular that it became normal looking after a while. And now in 2019, if you see one around, it's kind of weird looking again. Now, I never had one of those original iMacs. They were geared towards consumers and I was using my Mac professionally. So I was really happy when Apple adapted that design and came out with this version of the PowerMac G3. There was a beige box version of this computer at first, but eventually they came out with one called the blue and white PowerMac G3. And it was a really neat enclosure. As a matter of fact, I liked keeping it on top of my desk because I like how it looked rather than hidden away underneath. There's also an all-in-one version of this. It basically looked like a beige iMac. From 97 to 2001, Apple produced a really cool looking set of MacBooks, the G3 MacBooks. They had interesting little code names like Lombard, Pismo, Wall Street, Kanga. And they were this all black plastic design. Really neat. They felt really good to carry around. I owned one of these for years. It was a great portable computer. Now, no talk about vintage Macs is complete unless you mention the G4 Cube. It's basically a mid-range Mac from 2000 The base model only cost about $1,800 and it kind of was a precursor to the Mac Mini. So perhaps my favorite Mac laptop of all time was this one, the G4 PowerBook made with titanium. It was plagued with issues. Titanium wasn't a great metal as it turns out for making laptops, and they painted it and the paint wore off after time. The hinges on this thing were horrible, and after a few years pretty much everybody that owned one, the hinges broke or made it impossible to open and close. But the design set the stage for everything to come. From the titanium PowerBook to today's MacBook Pros pretty much is a gentle evolution all the way from 2001 to today. So let's finish up by talking about this one here. This is the G4 iMac, originally known simply as the new iMac. It came out in 2002 and it had a design very different than the previous iMacs. It used this LCD screen here and had this handle here. It made it easy to adjust and put the screen facing any direction you want, any angle you want. And so you can actually carry it by grabbing this. It had tons of ports. It was very capable. It looked great. And I can't bring myself to part with it even though I've given away or recycled Macs much newer than this one. I think I'll probably keep this one forever. So which vintage Mac design is your favorite? Which ones did you own and which ones do you still have because you can't bring yourself to part with it? Let me know in the comments. I publish new tutorials every weekday. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Then hit the little bell icon to get notifications for each new tutorial.